Okay, well, without any further ado, would you please give a welcome to a man who, at the age of 39, came to faith through a guy who just left last night, his friend Eric. And Eric was a drill sergeant. They met, and it was a fantastic story. I can't wait to hear. So, look, come up, Paul.
Morning. Oh dear. Good morning. That's better. Thought you were all asleep then for a minute. Well, I hope today we have. I hope we have a good time. I hope we learn something. I hope I learned something from you guys and what you've been doing. And this morning is just to share some stuff with you about what we've been doing in the UK, about trying to reduce crime. That's what we're here for, isn't it? And we've had some success in the UK. Not enough. There's a lot to do, but we've been trying to work with the government, which is not easy, as you know, and to try and persuade them that we're right and they're wrong. So they kind of get that. So as it says in the Bible, you know, St. Paul persuaded people about the gospel. So we've been trying to persuade the government that we can help them not only change men and women's lives through the power of the gospel, but also reduce reoffending, make society safer, and stop the taxpayer wasting money in a way. So that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about this morning. But before we start, I'd love to say a quick prayer, if you don't mind. Father, thank you for this gathering this morning. Thank you, Lord, that you are in this business that we're in, that you are our hands and feet. And Lord, I pray that you help us individually and collectively this morning do this work, discuss with one another, learn from one another, and move forward in this area. In Jesus' name, amen. John, I'm just checking, is there a DVD first? What? Just press the back key and see what happens. No? Sorry, I'm so technically minded. What are we doing first? We're doing the DVD first. That one. We'll use that one, eh? Great.
So many areas in society that people can fall through the gaps, like coming out of prison, finding themselves unemployed, homelessness, debt, caught up in addiction. And these chaotic lifestyles can lead to despair, even death. And sometimes it just seems impossible to find a way out. The William Wilberforce Trust works with the local church globally to confront injustice and poverty and care for the vulnerable and the marginalised, supporting people in spiritual and practical ways.
Before I joined the William Wilberforce Trust, I was unemployed for 2.5 years and I got the opportunity to come here through the job centre. So I come along, I got a driver's job, and now I'm the warehouse supervisor. And from that I've seen other people in the same situation as me and now in full-time work. It's like a community here. It's a great atmosphere here.
I guess I've been homeless, sleeping rough, on and off for about 7 or 8 years, and had a lovely warm welcome. We came here to St. Paul's. There's an area where you can do art, and so it really became a highlight of the week for many people, and I just love coming here.
In total, I spent over 15 years of my life in prison. And the issues that have arisen would be issues around housing, employment, and for me the most important thing would be to feel part of a community. I hope now that I'm in a position where I can give something back and help other people who are where I was.
I was in severe debt. It was awful. I owed money to pretty much every agency I know. I lost my business. I was threatened with eviction. They helped me sort through my problems. They worked with me, gave me so much positive information and just weekly support, and helped me structure and make a plan. They saved me from eviction, and now I'm debt-free. And I'm getting married and pretty much paying for my own wedding. It's a complete full turnaround. I was at rock bottom, and now I have light in my life.
So let me back up a little bit. That's the William Wilberforce Trust. That's what we founded in the UK about 18 months ago, and that's what's excitingly we're launching here in a few cities. The William Wilberforce Foundation, which is exactly the same sort of work. Just in the UK, it's called a trust, and over here, it's called a foundation. But to back up from that and bring you into that story, which I wanted to do this morning. How did we get to that point? All those men and women on that film that you saw are all committed Christians. Their lives have all been changed. They're all off the streets. They're in accommodation. They're doing worthwhile sort of work and different things. And they've changed. Their lives have changed. So how did we get to that point? Well, what happened, as David was saying, for me, and the most important thing to remember, and I've been speaking in a couple of churches and telling people, is about your story. Because your story is so important. You might not think you've got a dramatic sort of testimony and there's no fire and water and all this sort of stuff and dramatic stuff, but you have a testimony. For those who know the Lord in this room, you have a testimony of how you got there. Whether you were born into a Christian family and you've always gone to church and it's really boring and you hate it, whatever that is, it's a testimony. And for me, who didn't know about the Lord until I was 40 years of age, I find that incredible, that someone could know the Lord all their life. How do you do that? So for me, that's interesting. I'm just trying to encourage you that you might think, oh, I've always been a Christian, I've always gone to church, I did Sunday school, we got married. To me, that's fascinating. I don't know how you do it. Or I don't know how you did it. Or I don't know, your parents did that, or your grandparents managed to do that, or they persuaded the family, or whatever. But for me, that's really exciting. Seriously. So you must always tell your story. Otherwise, people like me will never find out about people like you and how that can change your life. You know the scriptures. I know an Anglican vicar, and I promise not to preach at you, but the scriptures say in Jeremiah that God has a good and perfect plan for us, a plan to prosper us, and a plan to give us hope in a future. And in Romans 5, I think 1-5, it says that God pours his hope, his love into our hearts, and that's a hope that doesn't disappoint. And he pours it into our hearts through the Holy Spirit. So we are hope carriers, you are hope carriers, whoever you are and wherever you've come from. And you must always tell your story. Again, the scriptures say you are to be ready in and out of season to give an explanation for your salvation. In other words, that means your testimony. Enough preaching. So for me, I grew up in a dysfunctional family. And I'm sure there's a few people in here who had a worse time than I did. And I can only explain about my bit. So I grew up in Manchester in the north of England, in quite a rough area, a place called Salford. My father was from Toxteth in Liverpool. My mother was from Birkenhead in Cheshire. So quite a combination of a family, if you know those areas. No siblings, just me. And I grew up in this house of dysfunction, really. Not violence. My father was very violent, but not to me, but to everyone else around him. So I grew up seeing my father fighting all the time. And if I'm honest, I quite like that. I was quite proud of my father. He was a big man, 6'3" in his pride, and nobody messed with him. And I kind of like that in a way growing up. My mother was just about 5 foot, and she was a tornado of a woman, and she could take anything on. My mum could really start an argument in an empty room and win. Do you know what I mean? She was an extraordinary woman. So a combination of those two together, it was pretty fiery. Both alcoholics, so I grew up in this environment of drink, of divorce. They were both divorced and they ended up getting divorced. And I think despair, really, and debt. We were always in debt. Not that I knew as a kid, it was hidden from me, but I could sense it. So again, in the scriptures in Proverbs, it says, hope deferred makes the heart sick. So I grew up in that environment of having a sick heart, really, as an analogy. And at the age of 15, I got into an argument with my father. My father threw me out. And in my arrogance and youth, I thought, I'll stay out and I'll look after myself. So at 15, 16, I was on the streets. Not for long, but I can honestly say I've been homeless and I've been on the streets. I got involved with a gang, a group of men and women that had moved into a squat, a derelict house really, in a place called Stockport. And I moved in with them and they looked after me. They started to look after me, but taught me and moved me into different areas of life which I wasn't involved in. Crime. It was petty theft at first, and that's how it starts, nicking from shops and then from warehouses and stores and then stealing cars. And I was pathetic at it. I was hopeless. So I constantly got caught by the police. Funny now, not then. And that led to a relationship with the police, bound over to keep the peace. Magistrates, courts, fines, probation. You have probation here, don't you, where you have to... Yep, so I had probation. That didn't work. And then I ended up with a short prison sentence. I went to prison in between Liverpool and Manchester, a place called Risley. It was a detention centre at the time, like a Borstal. And that frightened the life out of me. I thought I was pretty tough by then, but it frightened me. And I realised that there's always someone bigger than you around the corner. And I wasn't as clever as I thought I was. So when I came out of there, the main thing is I didn't want to go back. So I went home to my house, or where my mum and dad were, I thought, but they'd got divorced and separated and gone their separate ways, and someone else was in the house that I lived in. So that didn't go down too well. I then got a job, tried to keep myself busy, out of mischief, but I was bored. And I was saying last night, I saw this really good advertising poster for the army. It was two soldiers in camouflage uniform. They had a backdrop of mountains with snow on the top, and there was blue skies and the sun was shining. They were both skiing. And it said underneath, do you want a life of adventure? And it got me, just hit me. And I thought, yes, I do. And I signed up, and I spent the next 16 years in the military. And it saved my life. It absolutely, practically saved my life. I discovered there was a family there, dysfunctional family again, but a family within the army. It clothed me, it gave me some food, it gave me money, gave me a sense of purpose, some discipline, self-respect. And it taught me that I was good at sport, I had some leadership skills, and it encouraged me in different areas, and I loved it. So those 16 years were brilliant for me. But all the way through that, I had absolutely no moral compass, and I'm being honest with you. As a man, I had no direction. I wasn't of good character. I wasn't someone who would be a good friend. I was very selfish. I was very just involved in me. It was all about me, always, what I could get, what I could take, how I could prosper myself, and not really interested in anybody else. I'm just being honest with you. And that was my 16 years. So during that time, with that attitude of mind, I went through 2 marriages. I went through 2 divorces. I left a child to my first marriage, Clinton, when he was 3, and got divorced. Sent them back to England. I was on my own for a little while, then got married again. Another divorce, and that was my life. Too much drink, not an alcoholic, but too much drink. From being bullied at school, I learned I could fight and handle myself, so I became a bully in the army, in a uniform, and that was me. Doing well, 4 tours of Northern Ireland. I went to the Falklands, and I did quite well. I was a good soldier, but bad guy, dressed up in a uniform, really, so you wouldn't tell until you got to know me. And I wouldn't let you that close anyway. So that was me. And the reason that was, now I look back in retrospect, is because I didn't have a plan. There was absolutely no plan in my life. My mum and dad were atheists. I grew up in that environment, so no God at all. At school, there was no teaching that I can remember of religion, of faith, of God, of the Bible. I went to a comprehensive school in Manchester, and it was awful, and I was expelled at 15 for truancy, for lots of reasons. So nothing there. When I went to prison for a short time, I never met a chaplain. Don't know if there's any chaplains. Any chaplains in here? Yep. I love chaplains. But I never met a chaplain in the prison. No one came and knocked on that door. like you guys do and say, all right, son, don't panic. I know it's your first night. Let's have a cup of tea. Let's chat. No one did that to me at all. I wasn't looking for them, but you're supposed to look for me. Not blaming you, but chaplains are supposed to look for me. And then 16 years in the army, I never met a padre. Don't know if there's any padres in here, but I never met a padre. No padre came up to me during my tours in Northern Ireland. No padre came up and visited me during the Falklands campaign that I was at. No one came to the camps, the different regiments I was in. Again, never met a padre. I never met one of these God botherers. You know, no one bothered me at all for 40 years. Now, maybe I wasn't looking for them. Well, I wasn't looking for them, not with my lifestyle. But again, they're meant to look for me and tell me their story and tell me that God has a good and perfect plan for me. And that's the importance of it. I'm not condemning. I love chaplains, and I spend my life with chaplains and padres, encouraging them to tell their story and look for people like me. Because if you don't, I'm just one of those people who doesn't get bothered by the gospel, because I'm too busy messing everything up, damaging other people's lives and making a mess of my own, until you step in and say, you know what, Paul, it doesn't have to be like that. There's a plan. And if you just stop being selfish and just quieten down and just listen for a minute, maybe it might change. And that's what happened to me, as David said. I left the army, moved in with my girlfriend, and was getting on with my life in a place called Coventry, working in health clubs and just trying to get on with stuff. And I got a postcard arrived one morning in the mail with a load of bills and everything else. And I looked at this card, and the card said, you know, as a picture of a shepherd on the front, and the card said on the back, I've become a Christian. I'm praying for you. Why don't you marry the woman you're living with? Jesus loves you. And on the bottom it had the signature. And, you know, and to be honest, I thought, what on earth is this? And I looked at it, and I recognized the signature. And the signature was from a man called Eric. So when I looked at the name, it put a little bit of fear in me. And the reason it put fear in me is because this man called Eric was my senior instructor in the army. He's just gone back now. He's been with us on this tour. And he was a complete nightmare. I mean, I've described how I was, and I've missed out the details. He was awful. He was small. He was an army boxing champion, light heavyweight. He was a sergeant major. He carried a lot of rank and power. And he was my senior instructor. So I transferred from the artillery after 12 years to go into the Army Physical Training Corps. It's a year's course. It was a selection course, so 100 of us started to get in, and only 18 succeeded. And I was fortunate enough to be one of the 18. And during that time, they try and break you. I mean, they're trying to fail you in a way, if you get my drift, so that they get the people that really want to be in. And I wanted to be in. I had nothing else. And Eric was one of these people that constantly tried to break you, to fail you, to make you lose your temper, to see if you couldn't hack it. You know, you'd do something, then he'd fail you, and there was no logic around it. He was always angry, constantly angry and grumpy for whatever, you know. He'd get up and he'd be angry, go to bed and he'd be angry, and then he'd just make your life difficult. I was saying to one group what he did to me, and he was sat in the room, but it's true, so I'm not going to lie. He was a swimming specialist as well. So he was the coach, the squash specialist, the swimming specialist, sub-aqua, boxing. I mean, he was good at everything. So he was involved in my life every minute of the day. Nightmare. So we went swimming. You have to become a swimming instructor and a swimming coach. You qualify in all these different areas after a year. Then you go back to a unit, and then you teach that unit physical education. So we were learning swimming techniques in different ways and teaching. But before that, what happened is he came up to me and a good friend of mine, Slater, who was in the parachute regiment on the course, and came up and said, "Boys, do you want to go for a drink tonight?" Bit nervous when he came up to you. What's he want? And he said, no, I just think we should bond a little bit. Didn't know if I wanted to bond with him. Me and Slater, my mate, said, a bit nervous, but he is the senior instructor. If he likes us, then he might get a tick in the box and we might get through. So we went out for a drink with him, and we had quite a few drinks, and we came in quite late. And then the next morning we were on parade in the main swimming pool in a place called Sandhurst to do some instruction. He got us all lined up in our swimming trunks ready to go. He walks in the room and then shouts out my name. Shouts out Cowley and Slater, that's the two of us. So we move one pace forward, and then he walks up to us and smells my breath and says to me, "Have you been drinking?" "Yes, sir." Walks over to Slater. "Slater, have you been drinking?" Slater looks at me and goes, "Yes, sir, we have." We were with him all night. So then he says, "Turn to the left." So we turned to the left, and he made us do forward rolls all the way around this 50-meter swimming pool. And that's one thing, but you know that little knobbly bits that you get on pavements near traffic lights? This swimming pool had those knobbly bits all the way around the edge of it for your feet. So when we got back all the way around, standing in front of the team, all our back was cut and everything. And he just made us stand back into the group, and then made this sort of speech about saying, "Don't anyone ever come on his parade in his class stinking of alcohol again, or it would be worse, and I've just made an example of 2 people." That's what he was like. So he was almost schizophrenic, do you know what I mean? First he was your friend, then he was your nightmare, so you never quite knew what to do with him. Anyway, on the bottom of this card, it was his name. And I thought, he's lost it. He's gone, he's joined some sort of lunatic group, and now he's talking about Jesus. So I couldn't get this idea, really, of him, this character, and then talking about Jesus and God. So I went to see him. I was out the army. I wasn't scared of him anymore. He couldn't do anything, got no power over me. So I went to see him in Aldershot, and we spent 3 days together. And he witnessed to me. And it was really weird, because it was Eric, but he was talking in a different way. And what he was doing was sharing his testimony, sharing his story, and then telling me things out of the Bible about the love of God. And it was really weird. But you know what? It was really powerful. And it was attractive. I didn't tell him that. But what he was saying was attractive, and I wanted it. But I didn't know what it was. And we know now, don't we? It's the power of the gospel. It's the testimony. It's about God having a plan. He told me that scripture. He told me that God loved me. He had a purpose for me, that I could change, that I could be a good husband, that I could be a good dad, that I didn't have to keep getting into trouble. And I tell you, it was overwhelming for me. 40 years of my life, and I never heard any of that stuff at all. And he got me really interested in the stuff, and I left him, and I couldn't get the God stuff out of my head. You know what he'd done? He'd bothered me. God had bothered me, so it was all in my head. And I thought, could I change? Can I change? Can I stop this? Can I stop that? Is that true about that scripture? Does he love me unconditionally? Could I be useful? Could I change? Could I get my son back, maybe? Do I want to be all that stuff is called bothering you. It's what God does. He bothers us. And then I went on an Alpha course. Then I learned a bit more about the scriptures. And then I fell in love unashamedly with Jesus. Because I found this man, this character, who was strong, was kind of a man that worked with his hands, was outside. He would have been strong. He was a laborer in a way. He took on the authorities. And what attracted me to him is he knocked around with people like me. When I looked at the scriptures, he wasn't in the fancy posh houses and the places like that. He hung around on the streets. He knocked around with, let's say, ex-offenders. He knocked around with prostitutes. He spoke to the people that no one ever wanted to speak to. He helped those who had been alcoholics, or those who had been in prison, those who had been uneducated and expelled. And I thought, wow, I want to know more about him. I was bothered again. And I started to get more and more, and long story short, I gave my life to Christ. And I said, you know what, if you're up there and all this stuff's true and you can help me change, then I want to know some more. And that was my start of my journey. And as you know, those of you who have been on that journey or have been on it, stuff starts to change. And I went on a prison visit, which I didn't want to go on, but the lady in our church was very persuasive and kept hassling me. And I went on a prison visit, and I met some men in there. And I thought, I wonder if they would like the Alpha course that I went on. I wonder if they could relate to this stuff that I got. And we started Alpha in the prisons in '97. And that's where I'm winding into how all this stuff started and how I got involved, by someone telling me the gospel. That's why you've got to speak. Every time you're in that uncomfortable position, or you don't want to talk about it, or you're fed up, or the person's really grumpy and aggressive, tell them about the gospel, because you never know where you are in that link. The first link of the chain might be they ignore you, they're rude to you, they spit at you, or whatever they do. But you might be the last link in the chain where they go, I want some of that. So you never know where you are. And that's what happened to me. I got involved in the prisons. We started Alpha in the prisons in 97. It's grown now through the UK. 80% of the prisons now run Alpha, so 130 out of 150 run it as an evangelistic course, along with other stuff, and the Sycamore Tree and Prison Fellowship, and we're partnered with them. And there's a great deal of evangelism going on in the prisons in the UK. It's also spread around the world. 70 countries around the world are now running it, prison systems. And it started to grow, and men and women came to faith in large numbers, really, in the prison system in the UK. And then I realized we were talking about evangelism on the inside, but we weren't in fact doing anything on the outside. All these churches that were running Alpha of all these Christian denominations, but they weren't really engaged in the prisons. So we started a charity called Caring for Ex-Offenders, which is a charity which we'll talk about later on. But really, through the church, the local church, the use of volunteers, it meets men and women at the gate as they're released, and helps them go back into a community, a church-based community, and helps them find accommodation and employment, and mentors them and supports them in their addictions or dysfunctional areas that they're trying to get out, helps with family breakdown, helps with addiction, helps with reoffending, and it's starting to work in the UK. It's starting to have some effect. The reoffending rate in the UK is about 80% at the top end. So 8 out of 10 men will be back in prison within 2 years. That's a government statistic fact. Those in our church, I'm responsible, and I work in a large Anglican church in central London. We've got 4 sites, 12 services, about 5,000 people through on a Sunday, and we've got 40 ex-offenders. And our reoffending rate within that sort of community, which is quite large, is down to 18%. We've only lost like 2 of them since '97. And those 2, one of them I helped put back in prison because he nicked a load of kit from us, and I'm quite happy to tell the police that he did that. But I also went in prison to see him once he'd got arrested and said, you know, we'll meet you at the gate when you come out and we'll start again. But don't nick from us, otherwise you go to prison. Simple as that. And then he's out in a couple of years, I think, and we'll meet him again and we'll work through it. So that's 18% reoffending rate in our church. And in the UK, nationally, those who've gone through the charity, the men and women come to faith in prison, however they do that, and then they get linked in with the charity, which is national, and they do the stuff I've just mentioned. We're down to 22 to 25% reoffending. So it's starting to get, the government's attention. Hopefully for spiritual reasons, but it's not, it's through financial reasons. Because the reoffending rate in the UK costs over £14 billion a year. So that's what the taxpayer has to pay, 14 billion and rising. With all the different costs, magistrates' courts, keeping men and women in prison, running prisons, all that stuff is about 14 billion. So the reoffending rate is getting reduced. The taxpayer is paying less money. Those guys that we've got in our church, we worked out that we've saved over £2 million just with those. So then you start multiplying that with all the people in the UK that have gone through the charity and how much they're saving, the church is saving the taxpayer, and then you start to dream and imagine if all the churches in the UK that are running Alpha, the 7,500 of them, of all Christian denominations, if all those got actively engaged in this work, can you imagine what that would do? I mean, that starts to excite me, because then you can start really hitting the reoffending rates. Then you can start to engage the churches more. Whether the men and women are fully fledged Christians or not, we're meant to help them. And if the church starts engaging with that, it's tremendous. And I think the government in the UK have just started to glimpse that. They're having a paradigm shift. 1, because they've got no money. 2, because they're having to look at the church. And 3, I think, they know we've got the answer. And we don't Bible bash people. We don't run around with tambourines. We don't become embarrassing. Do you know what? We just do what we do. And we're very good at it. I mean, us, collectively, we're good at it. We're a community. We're called to do that. We have grace. We have faith. We have patience. And we work with men and women because we know people can change. And that's what's starting to happen. And that's what's exciting here. So that's the Caring for Ex-Offenders. That's how we got into it. And then we realized that these men and women that we are helping have some form of addiction. You know, I think the UK statistic is 70% of men and women in prison or leaving prison have some form of mental health issue or some sort of addiction or dysfunction. And they can get rid of those. Some are deeper, some are more affected than others, but 70% of people in prison have some form of dysfunction. When they're in, they get it when they get in, they've had it when they went in, or they're trying to get rid of it when they come out. So we realized that we had to do something with addiction. So we worked with addiction organizations, and we put together a little course working with AA in the 12 steps called the Recovery Course. Then we realized that some of the men and women coming out are in debt. They were in debt before they went in for obvious reasons, or they're in debt when they come out, or their families are in a state with finances, so we started a debt counselling service. Then we realized that in the UK we release people with no fixed abode, so we release them homeless, and then we're surprised when they reoffend. Good one, that one is. So we started working with hostels and housing associations, and started trying to pull those organizations that do that and work with the council. So all these different areas of work, we started these ministries or areas that help the men and women when they come out, and then lumped it all together and really called it the William Wilberforce Trust, the William Wilberforce Foundation. And what that is really is a collection of work that is around him or her coming out of prison, or coming off the streets, or coming out of addiction, or coming out of a broken family, and putting a church around them. And working with statutory organizations, faith-based organizations, and secular organizations. Who cares? I don't care, as long as it works and we get it together, and as long as it's faith-based. And the community that these men and women go back into are us, because we care, because that's what the church is meant to do. That's why you've had an experience, that's why you've changed, that's why you're experienced, that's why you're resourced, that's why you're in a community. So that's what the William Wilberforce Trust is all about, and that's why it's exciting to launch it here, and you'll hear more about it later on. But that's how we started, and there's a lot of stuff in that. The churches have to be trained. We've got resources. In the UK now there's 700 churches trained up. Not a lot, but 700 trained up within the charity care for ex-offenders, which they're resourced. They've gone through 1 or 2 days training. They know how to accept ex-offenders. They know what to look for. They know how to help them. And that's why, because they're trained up, and the men and women are coming to faith in the prisons, and if you get that combination right, then it will work. You know, and I'm not an educated man, and I say to the government, I was asked to advise them in different areas about reoffending. I mean, who am I? And I've said to them, sir, this is not rocket science. Actually, it's just basic stuff. And we, the church, collectively, is equipped to do this. We just need a little bit of training. We need to work together. We need not to be scared of the secular organizations. We need to gain their experience and do what we do well. And that is welcome people into our community. And they're interested. Because what I've realized as I travel around, and I spend a lot of time in prison around the world, is that the men and the women, mostly men in prison, the men and women in prison who come to a knowledge of Christ, however they do that, are scared of the church. And I find that really hard as a minister and as someone of faith. They're scared of you. They're scared of us. And then I realize when I talk to churches that the churches are scared of them. Now that's that unspoken sort of conversation where the men and women, I was in Canada in a detention center there, some really rough guys who'd come to Christ on an Alpha course, and I was chatting to them. And in the end, one of them stood up and said to me, you know what, Paul, we're slightly nervous about going to church. This is a man that had spent over half his life in prison, was a big guy, and was scared of you. And I thought, what is going on? And then you speak to some church people, and they go, I'm a bit nervous about, you know, I don't know if we're set. They're scared. So if you get them scared of you, and you're scared of them, what's going to happen? Nothing. You know, because we can be pretty scary people, I think. You know, I'm an Anglican vicar. When I first started, I didn't know in a service if you stand up, sit down, you know what are you doing? It's quite nerve-wracking. And I remember going in churches when I was on my little search. You know, I'd go in some churches and they'd be so cold you could kind of skate down the middle. frosty churches. And then I'd walk in some churches and, I'd get overwhelmed with mostly lovely women bringing you cups of tea and biscuits. And you think, what, And then they speak a language that you don't know, and they dress, and I'm just making a point. Those men and women don't know what you're like. And to be honest, a lot of churches don't know what they're like. And if we can bridge that gap, and maybe that's through caring for ex-offenders, maybe that's through a little bit of training, maybe that's through understanding the dynamics of a man or woman who's been locked up for some period of time and is slightly dysfunction, but wants to change but doesn't know how to do that, and is slightly nervous of you. And if you gather around them and you help them and you support them and you hold their hand a little bit, no matter how big they are, and you just say, you know what, it's going to be all right. It's going to be all right. We're going to look after you. I know your family's gone. I know they've disappeared. We'll be your family. Let's get to know each other. And that's caring for ex-offenders. Now, that's not rocket science, is it, really? Every single one of you in here is qualified to do that. And all I'm doing and all we're trying to do through this is galvanize us together and say, we are all skilled. We're all resourced. We're all in different areas. We are the answer to reducing reoffending for the men and women that want to move into an area of faith, who generally want to change, who want to be good fathers, who want to be good husbands, who want to work and have some dignity and respect, who want to get on and contribute back to society. For those men and women, there's real hope to change. I want to finish on just one story. John, if I can get this to work, how do I get him up? Can we see that? Can we just dim the light a little bit? And I just want to tell you about this guy. This picture is a picture of Eddie. Eddie is an extraordinary character. He ticks all the boxes that I've just mentioned to you, what I've been running through, which I won't repeat. But he was in prison for a long time of his life. He was born in Scotland. He's a Glaswegian. Came down to London. Got in trouble as a kid, went to prison, spent most of his life in prison, was released, homeless, was released, addicted. He got an addiction in prison. When I met him looking like that, he was addicted to cocaine and heroin. Every vein in his body had collapsed. Some of you are far more experienced in drug and alcohol than I am. But every vein or every main artery had been overused and abused and collapsed. And he was injecting heroin into the main artery in his thigh. That was the only one that was left. And what happened there is that vein collapsed, that artery collapsed, he collapsed. He was taken into a hospital in central London. And what was going to happen to him? He was seriously ill. They were going to have to amputate his leg. Long story short, Eddie wasn't too happy with that idea and checked himself out of the hospital, collapsed, got up again, stayed on the streets for a while, then walked into one of our night shelters. Through the William Wilberforce Trust, we started a night shelter. All we did is I thought, we've got these churches, we've got 4 sites, they're doing nothing at night, I'm going to open them up. When I open them up and get the men and women to come in, get some volunteers, and we started night shelters through the winter months. Eddie came into that looking like that. And if you've ever been around homeless people, they have a smell. I'm being honest, they do. Now, if you can sense that smell, if you've met anyone, and then times it by about 100, that's what Eddie smelled like. He lived in a skip at one point. So that was him, that was his face, that's what he constantly looked like. He came into the night shelter. He was loved by people like you, volunteers, who loved him, never condemned him, never told him to change or get a shower or he stinks or whatever. And then from that, he came to our drop-in. The drop-in for the William Wilberforce stuff is just an extension of the night shelter. So I only had them for a few hours during the night and I wanted to talk to them. I couldn't because they'd gone, so we started a drop-in, which means they can come in at 8 o'clock in the morning. 3 days a week we do it now, and they can stay till 4 in the afternoon, and we let them read newspapers. We give them something to eat. We give them haircuts. Some of the women that come in, we do nails, manicures, and they play chess and they talk, and we have some council workers and casework, and we get to know them. So Eddie came into that, and some of the volunteers like you got to know him. No one condemned him. And then one of the young things, the volunteers who were great, said to him, Eddie, you should try an alpha course. So Eddie just nodded and said, you know, whatever, I'll try that if you say it. And he came on our Alpha course at Holy Trinity Brompton, Anglican Church, which is a little bit white middle class, a little bit posh in some areas. And Eddie came on it looking like that. And I work on that and I speak on it sometimes. And it was really funny, naughty but funny to see him sat in a group. You know, and everyone trying not to hold their nose. Trying not to move away from Eddie, you know, but loving him. And I know that's funny, but that had such a dramatic effect on Eddie that they loved him. He was overwhelmed with it. And on if you know the Alpha, there's a bit where they go away and we do teaching on the Holy Spirit, or they do a day concentrated speaking. And Eddie was on that, and I happened to be on it. And I was at the back of this building, something like this, where I was just stood at the back. The speaker had finished speaking and said, you know what, enough talk. Why don't you just turn to the person on your left or right and pray for them? And I turned to my left, and Eddie was stood next to me. And he looked at me, and I turned away. Because I thought, you know what, I can't pray for him. One, I don't want to touch him and lay hands on him. And secondly, he just stank, and I couldn't bear it. And I walked out. And as I walked out, I felt God say to me, I don't know how God speaks to you, but he's quite strong with me sometimes. He said to me, get back in there and pray for that man. So I went back in and I said, Eddie, can I pray for you? He said, yes, I'd love to. And we talked, and I fumbled through some prayer. He made a commitment to Christ, and then he broke down and started to cry. And was just in a real state. It just all came out. You know, he was tired, he was fed up, he was scared, he was fearful of dying. He didn't know what to do. He thought it was awful. He was sobbing, and I was sobbing, and then Eddie started to change a little bit. He got involved in the community. And long story short, after a couple of years, I just want to show you a picture of Eddie now. If I can do this, where are we? Okay, there we go. That's Eddie now. You know, and Eddie is an extraordinary man. He texts me every morning. You know how he's working the 10 hours time different now, I don't know, but he texts me this morning, and he's sending me scriptures every morning to encourage me about what I'm doing with you. You know, not only has he changed, and you know, in that face, he's a member of the site, the church that I look after. I mean, a committed volunteer. He's not drunk, he's not on drugs. He's an amazing character to be around. He's so enthusiastic about anybody. You know, he helps out on the Sunday in the church, runs a cafe. He's organizing the volunteers. He's just finished a diploma in theology at one of our sites, learning about the Bible because he wants to know more about it. Not only that, we put him into a scheme in central London. We've got these shops called Pret-a-Manger, which are coffee and sandwich shops. And they're a secular organization, but they run a scheme to help deprived kids. People give money, and then they try and mentor these kids in London and get them back into education. And you know, some of them have been abused physically and all sorts of things. And we put Eddie forward as a volunteer just to see if he could do that. And I found out while I was here that they just offered him a full-time job. So Eddie is now employed mentoring kids who have and come from a dysfunctional background. And Pret-a-Manger, this secular organization, love him. So they're paying him, and he's just been employed. First job he's ever had in his life. So Eddie's changed. You know, he's working. He's now in a flat. We've got some accommodation for him. He's sharing with two other guys. He's a member of a community, and he's stunning. And I unashamedly love him to bits as a brother. And that is the power of the gospel. That is sharing the story, but it's also the practical side of the gospel. He was loved by a community, by a church. He was encouraged that, you know, he could do this Bible study, which led to a diploma in theology, that he could clean himself up, that he could get his act together, that he could contribute back into the church, into society, and he could possibly go for a job, because God has a good and perfect plan for us, a plan to prosper us. And he started to believe that through people like you encouraging him. And he's changed. And now he's changing other people's lives. So the impact that the church can have is extraordinary. That's just one man's life. Now start timing that by 10 and by 100 and by 1,000. There's 10 million people in prison around the world. in 22,000 establishments in, I think, 129 different areas or countries. And 90% of that population will be released from prison. But only 10% are not coming out, or they die in there around the world. But 90% of the prison population is coming out. And they're coming out back into society and back into a strange world. And to be honest, I live in central London. I live in a nice area in London. And my car's been stolen. I have a motor scooter's been nicked twice. The house next door has been broken into. The lady next door was mugged on the street because of her phone. I've got a 15-year-old daughter which I'm nervous to let out on the streets. I don't like her going out, and I won't even let her go to the shop. I want my society safer. I want men and women coming to Christ. Of course I do. I'm a priest. That's what I'm after. I'm after their soul, unashamedly. But I also want society to be safer. I want my streets to be safer. I want my car to stop getting nicked. You know, I want my insurance rates to go down instead of going up. I want to allow my daughter to go to the shop on her own and get some sweets. I want my society safer. And I also want men and women to come to faith. But it's not just about that, it's a combination of that. And you know, and those 10% of the 90% in prison that are being released, they're coming out anyway. They're coming to your area, your country, your village, your street, your neighborhood, whether you like it or not. They're coming, and I'd prefer if they come out changed. Prefer if they come out wanting to contribute to society and not nick all my kit or damage me or my family. You know, I want them to be like Eddie. I want them to change. And I do not believe that that's an impossible thing to do. I believe it's possible. Because it happened in England before. Just to finish, you know, when I became a Christian, I started reading bits and pieces, and people gave me biographies to read, and, you know, lots of good people trying to get me reading. And I got stuck on some biographies of reformers of the past. And I started looking at these characters like William Wilberforce, who for 46 years of his life was determined to get that bill for the abolition of slavery through. 11 defeats in Parliament, it almost killed him, and 3 days before he died, it was passed. And that had an amazing effect in England. And not only that, it affected across the water to Abraham Lincoln, who was encouraged by Wilberforce's tenacity and determination, and he was then determined to put in the 13th Amendment, which is the abolition of slavery in the States. And that had a massive knock-on effect around the world. One man who had a vision, a man of faith. And then you get people like Lord Shaftesbury, an Englishman, who went to visit the workhouses in the 18th century and saw kids working 10, 15, 20 hours a day sometimes and dying in mills and workhouses and down mines and couldn't bear it. And he brought in the Labour Act of a 10-hour working day, which is a lot, but it started to reduce it. And the Asylum Act he brought in. He went into a house that was looking after people who were mentally ill and challenged. And they were chained up against the wall, living in just mess. And he said, it's not on. And he brought in the Asylum Act, which is our Mental Health Act now, which we have in... So all those things. William Booth, founder of the Salvation Army. You know, Octavia Hill, a young girl of 14 whose parents were wealthy, then they went bankrupt. She moved into the poor area of London. And then she realized that there was people, 25, 30 people living in one room, poor people, and said it's not on. So she established housing. And what we have now in the UK is council housing and social housing. That started from her. 14-year-old kid had something. So all these people, Elizabeth Fry, prison reformer, you know, we wouldn't have female prisons except she went into Newgate prison in London, had men, women and children and teenagers all in one area, all being abused, came out and said, no, not on. Lobbied Parliament. And then we had the first female prison reform. So all these men and women that I looked at were interesting characters, you know, but they were all men and women of faith. And they all had areas of influence that you have. And they changed society. And I thought, you know what? That's what I want to do. I wanted to change society. I want to stop this reoffending, these men and women going in and out, in and out, in and out, lives being wrecked, addictions, people dying on the streets. People like Eddie have got no hope to have hope. And we can do that. And I really believe that the reoffending rate will start to drop even more not only just in the UK, but here and around the world. And I want to see, Lord, please, I want to see prisons closing down. Why not? You know, I said that in a government meeting with the Secretary of State, and they all looked at me as I was a complete lunatic. And I said, why not? If you reduce reoffending, what does that mean? Men and women stop reoffending, so they stop committing crime, so they stop going to prison, so we've got to close some prisons down. Does that make sense? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Of course it does. So why can't we see that? Are you up for that? Yeah. Of course you are, because it's happened before. You know, the revivals in the UK and Scotland and things like that many years ago. Prisons closed down, they were empty. You know, men stopped drinking and abusing their families and wives and gave up drink. Why can't that happen again? Lord, let that happen again in our time. Let the church stand up and be known what it's for. A community of loving people who will help and change people. I feel like I'm preaching now. But that's what we're... But you know, that's what this is, reducing crime. That's what today is about. And you, if you've not been told, you are really special. You're really important. You're experienced in lots of different areas. And if you come together and if you say, you know what, we are going to be a church that is going to get involved in this. We're going to take men and women out of prison. It's going to be hard work. It's going to be messy. But we're going to get some training. We're going to be as professional as we can. And you know what? We are going to start to love those men and women and embrace them and stop them going back to prison. And if we all do that, then that's going to have a tremendous effect on society. Amen.
What do you think of that?